Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, poet and author Blake Morrison and actor Yusra Warsama explore the Bronte sisters' remarkable legacy and discuss some of the sisters' rare manuscripts and first editions that form part of the Blavatnik Honresfield Library. Recorded live at the 2023 Bradford Literature Festival, this episode breathes new life into the words of Yorkshire's most famous literary family.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Taylor, and I'm the Culture Producer North for the British Library, and I'd like to personally welcome you to today's event, Behind the Brontes with Blake Morrison and Yusra Warsama. The background to today's event comes from the outstanding collection of literature that is the Blavatnik Honresfield collection. This collection, which hadn't been seen by the public for over 80 years, was purchased for the nation in 2022 by the Friends of National Libraries with the support of the Blavatnik Family Foundation and the National Heritage Memorial Fund, and many other generous supporters. This collection was shared with libraries and institutions around the UK, but the Bronte-related material was given to a partnership between the University of Leeds, the Bronte Partnership Museum, and the British Library. Two of these partners are, of course, based in Yorkshire, while the British Library has had a long presence in the region dating back many decades at Boston Spa, which is home to over 70% of the national collection. To celebrate this Bronte partnership and to ensure these items can finally be seen by the public in Yorkshire, the three partners have worked together to co-curate an exhibition, Becoming the Brontes. This opened just 2 days ago at the Treasures of the Brotherton Gallery at the University of Leeds and is now on display till October the 28th, so I do encourage you to check it out if you can. But we also aim to encourage new audiences to share this extraordinary collection through events in Yorkshire. Noted author Blake Morrison has developed this exciting lecture through his research of the Bronte materials in the Blavatnik Honresfield collection, and this forms the basis of today's partnership event with the Bradford Literature Festival. Please join me and welcome Yusra Warsama and Blake Morrison.
The old Stoic. Riches I hold in light esteem, and love I laughed to scorn, and lust of fame was but a dream that vanished with the morn. And if I pray, the only prayer that moves my lips for me is, leave the heart that now I bear and give me liberty. Yes, as my swift days near their goal, 'tis all that I implore, through life and death the chainless soul with courage to endure.
Thank you, Yusra. I was thinking today what poem to begin with, and I did wonder about No Coward Soul, which is probably the most famous of Emily's poems, and which another Emily Dickinson, had read at her funeral. And you know, it seems a great slogan to put on a t-shirt, No Coward Soul. But I think A Chainless Soul is just as good, and to me it helps to sum up the difference between Emily and her sisters and brothers, that she was the independent one. She was soulful, but she was also courageous, careless of wealth, as we heard, and fond of telling anyone who put pressure on her or complained about her rhymes or her silence, her shyness and silence. I wish to be as God made me. She had a spirit that was altogether unbending, according to Charlotte, who got very exasperated with it in Emily's final weeks, when Emily would not see a doctor. No poisoning doctor was going to be allowed to come near her. And as Charlotte said, she was taken from life in her prime, aged just 30, 175 years ago. But of course, it isn't altogether a case of promise unfulfilled, because we have Wuthering Heights. one of the most popular and most discussed novels in the English language. The frustration is that she left so little behind. That second novel, for instance, there was a suggestion she was working on a second novel, and one of the authors who was here today, I think, has a passage in the novel where, if I'm remembering right, Emily buries the second novel somewhere in the graveyard at Haworth, which Charlotte was rumoured also to have buried something there, which is perhaps why people at the parsonage tell me they sometimes see people digging around in the graveyard in hopes of finding something. You know, we have Wuthering Heights, we have the poems, but apart from a few diary pages and a couple of letters, that's all we have of Emily. And as has been said a couple of times in earlier sessions, maybe it's exactly that lack of material, the paucity of material, that makes her the most romantic and exotic, glamorous even member of the family, because she's an empty sheet onto which we can impose whatever we like. And you know, there've been all sorts of theories about her as being autistic, anorexic, having a death wish, and so on. Grand theories come up all the time. I don't particularly have a grand theory, but I have contributed, I have to confess, to this Bronte mania, if you like, that still possesses us all. Quite a number of years ago, I worked on the libretto for a musical of Wuthering Heights with the composer Howard Goodall, who some of you will be familiar with. And, you know, it was Leicester Haymarket seemed interested, and then they heard that there were about 4 other librettos of musicals going the rounds, including one for Cliff Richard to star as Heathcliff, which, you know, takes some getting your head round. But, of course, that was the one that did get put on. And then more recently, I did a play with Northern Broadsides Theatre Company, which some of you may know. It was called We Are Three Sisters, which took Chekhov's play and imposed the Brontes on the Three Sisters, which sounds very weird. But actually, Chekhov did know about the Brontes, and there's a bit more to it than you might imagine. And I do remember a sort of 12-year-old girl coming up afterwards and wanting desperately to meet the actor who played Emily. Well, not that part stuck out particularly to my mind, but it was Emily. And I think everybody, unavoidably maybe, has their favourite Bronte. I don't approve of it. I think we should love them all. But it's unavoidable almost to not have a favourite. In my teens, I got interested in the Brontes because I lived 15 miles away. I lived at the top of a hill in a vicarage. I had an Irish parent, mother actually, not father. The village was called Thornton, though it was a different Thornton in Craven. And, you know, the parallels seemed unavoidable, really. Charlotte was my first love, because how could any school child not identify with the beginning of Jane Eyre? And then Anne later drew me in because of the portrayal of alcoholism in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. I published a book earlier this year called Two Sisters, which is about, or partly about, how my sister Jill's drink problems led to her premature death 4 years ago, not very far from here. And then there's Branwell, who always sort of haunted and frustrated me, the privileged one who somehow blew it all away. And these days, as I get older, I think of Patrick, who lived to be, was it 84? He outlived them all, which no parent probably wants to do, and who'd little or no idea, really, of the extent of his 3 daughters, the 3 surviving daughters, writing. In fact, I had a scene in We Are Three Sisters in which It was loosely based, I think, on the account Elizabeth Gaskell gives, in which she tells her father that she's published a novel. So I'll be Patrick, if you'll be Charlotte.
I shall pretend, yes.
Oh, so long as there's food on the table and needlework to occupy you, what more in life do you need?
There is one thing.
What's that, pray?
Books. We couldn't live without books.
True enough for all readers in this house.
Not just readers. Every night, when you're in bed, we write.
Oh, I know, you're always writing letters.
Not just letters. Stories, poems.
Oh, I was a bit of a poet myself in my youth.
What I'm trying to say is that I've written a book.
Have you, my dear?
Yes, and I'd like you to read it.
I can't. It'll be wasted on me.
But your eyesight's good now. You said it yourself.
Even so, I can never make out your writing.
It's not a manuscript, it's printed.
But the cost! How could you afford it?
I didn't pay for it to be printed. A publisher did.
They must be daft. Nobody's heard of you.
I've chosen a different name. Cura Belsi.
What good will that do? No one's heard of him either.
No, but the book seems to be selling. I brought you some reviews.
All right, I'll try a page or two. But you mustn't forget your duties. Books can't be the business of a woman's life.
Of course not, Father.
To come back to Emily's, well, to Emily and why I'm concentrating on her today and what I was saying about how little of her work we have. One aspect of this lessness has been the invisibility of the notebook in which she transcribed her poems. I'm going to just chuck that away, it's messing things up here. This is the notebook that Charlotte said she accidentally lighted on, and which left her with a deep conviction that these were not common effusions, nor at all like the poetry women generally write. They had a peculiar music, wild, melancholy, and elevated. Well, Charlotte was, intrusive, and Emily, perhaps angry at that intrusion, took some persuading that the poems were worth making public. But a selection of them did appear, along with poems by Anne and Charlotte, in an edition of 1846, which sold just 2 copies until the novels the sisters subsequently published made anything they'd written worth having. Now, as to that notebook, it ended up in the ownership of the Victorian industrialist William Law, and it became known as the Honresfield manuscript. At some point in the 1930s, photographs were taken of it. Sorry, I've lost myself. Photographs were taken of it, but the notebook itself disappeared from view, and you got a couple of scholars doing editions of Emily's poems. Janet Ghazari said, it's missing. Derek Roper said, it's been accessible for more than 50 years. Well, make that 90 years nearly, because as you've heard, it was only last year that the sale went through of the collection. And it is an extraordinary collection, because as well as that notebook, there are quite a number of other items. I mean, I could go on, but the 7 miniature books that Charlotte wrote and put together as a child, one of which begins, "Reader, I tell you what, my heart is like to break," which you might think, there's an echo of "Reader, I married him" there. There's a pencil sketch of a mullioned window that Emily did, aged 10. 10 poems that Anne wrote, as none too happily, as a governess. Letters from Branwell to Hartley Coleridge. First editions of novels. All that you can see at the Brotherton Library, along with a page, along with the Emily notebook, where the pages open at No Coward Soul, I think it is. And if you go to the parsonage, as well as the usual things you see, like the John Martin paintings and Charlotte's trunk and so on, you get a diary paper that Emily wrote in 1841, and books donated to a servant at the parsonage, Charlotte's book of rhymes that's, I'm told, never been published. She was very young at the time. A portrait of a peasant woman. There's so much. So I'm being selective here, but the Brotherton exhibition's free. It's on till the end of October. It is a sort of once-in-a-lifetime chance to read, to see this stuff, which will probably never be all there together again. Well, the notebook. I will make you jealous if I tell you I held it in my hands a month ago, which was spooky, of course. There it was, a tiny bound volume, about 7 inches by 4 inches, smaller than any paperback, and of course even tinier in neat, barely legible ink. 31 of Emily's poems, mostly carefully dated. First 4 of them written in 5 weeks when she was just 19. Crammed into 21 pages, some pages so crammed that she squeezes in as many as 52 lines with spacing between the stanzas. And I'd made the mistake of going to the manuscript room in the British Library without a pair of spectacles. I know. And really, you need a magnifying glass more than specs. And as you'll see also in the notebook at the front, that William Law writes in pencil, it's the most valuable of all the Bronte manuscripts I possess. So it was a privilege and very spooky to read through it, and to marvel, among other things, at Emily's weird and wonderful, if not terrible, spelling. You know, beauty, B-E-U-T-Y, bosom, B-O-S-E-M, exist, E-X-S-I-S-T, magic, M-A-J-I-C, and best of all, I think, watch, W-H-A-C-H. So I was lucky, and to see, you can see in the Brotherton the note appended by Charlotte, we think, opposite No Coward Soul, never was better stuff penned. Now, I have to confess, my own poetic tastes were formed in my teens and by modern poets, Eliot, Wilfred Owen, W.H. Auden, D.H. Lawrence, and before that, probably Wordsworth and Blake and Coleridge and Tennyson and Browning, and Emily came lower down the list, really, partly because in some ways she felt old-fashioned, but also that discipline of her rhyme, those quatrains that she always used, which somehow you think hold her back. She doesn't sound modern, or rather, she doesn't sound modern unless you listen to a poem like this.
Here, the world is chill, turf, sod and tombstone, dank moss dripping from the wall. What gloomy guests beneath the turf, beneath the mould, the common paths that others run? There was a time when my cheek burned like love, like a rose briar, a house dog on the glowing floor. Sweet land of light, I saw my fate without its mask, this wild breeze with me. My darling pain, the little lamp burns straight, dreading every breeze. The night is darkening around me. I'll walk where the flocks are feeding and the wind blows on the mountainside. I'm true to my wild will.
Oh, I'd love to pretend that was a rediscovered Emily poem that I lighted on in that notebook, but it isn't. There was a copy of it over there at one point, and maybe it will reappear. But it is entirely composed of Emily lines, but they're sort of taken as random and put together. And I thought it really captures one of her gifts for observation. It's both the outer world and what she observes, and very much the inner world of Emily. And one effect for me of reading that notebook was to question the idea of her unworldliness that Charlotte talked of, and also to see how much she complicated ideas about gender. I mean, if you think of what Charlotte said, that they're not at all her poems like the poetry that women generally write, she also noted how Emily was stronger than a man in battling her last illness. And then, of course, Monsieur Heger, do we say Heger or Heger, the Brussels teacher that she was infatuated by, said she should have been a man and paid tribute to her imperious will. And then there was the assistant curate, William Waitman, who might have had something similar in mind when he nicknamed her the Major, which Charlotte took up that name and teased her about it. And, you know, certainly her behaviour sometimes seemed to display a militaristic ruthlessness and violence. We know she loved animals, but there is the time she punished, if we believe these stories, her beloved dog Keeper, who had a habit of lying on beds upstairs, which wasn't allowed in the parsonage, and which Emily dealt with by beating him in the eyes with her fists, to the point where his eyes and head swelled up. And you get other little episodes of determination and violence mentioned about Emily. When Patrick asked her as a child how to deal with Branwell if he was naughty, she said, well, first reason with him, and if he doesn't listen, then whip him. We also have those stories, I don't know whether they're true or not, of her firing pistols with her father, which she was supposed to be very good at. And as to this idea of Charlotte's that she had no worldly wisdom, you have to remember that when the Bronte sisters were left money and shares on their aunt's death, it was Emily who put in the work of checking their investments in the railways were financially sound. She seemed to do it very thoroughly. So I'm thinking of the way that gender binaries break down in her writing. The two narrators in Wuthering Heights, one a man, Mr. Lockwood, the other a woman, Nellie Dean. And meanwhile, Cathy thinks that she and the man she loves are indistinguishable. Nellie, I am Heathcliff. He's more myself than I am. There's no simple he and she. And of course, Emily took on a pseudonym which suggests, Alice Bell, that she was probably a man. And we know she was furious when Charlotte, on the trip to see the publishers in London, exposed their real names and said, we are three sisters. And to me, I don't think Emily's anger was just the invasion of her privacy. That adoption of a probably male pseudonym had been liberating for her. She wrote Wuthering Heights with a freedom and a lack of inhibition, perhaps, that she'd not otherwise have had. So rather like Catherine telling Nellie, I am Heathcliff, I can imagine a reproach to Charlotte saying, but I am Alice Bell. Well, I don't want to push it too far as Emily as a gender bender, Emily as trans, bisexual, or whatever. And I'm certainly not recruiting her to the patriarchy. As well as her Alice Bellism, you'd have to set her pursuit of domestic tasks. She was the most industrious of the sisters, it seems, when it came to household tasks. Was ironing, cooking, generally taking charge of the kitchen. And loved home. What on earth is half so dear, so longed for as the hearth of home, she writes in one poem. But she enjoyed her imaginative travelling beyond home, beyond Haworth, and beyond her sisterly identity. I don't think either that what some would see as the brutishness, the violence of Heathcliff is as repellent to Emily as it was to Charlotte. I mean, Emily toyed with the idea that Cathy somehow embodied him. And it's precisely this bedrock manliness that Cathy esteems, in contrast to the pallid foppishness of the man she marries, Edgar. As she tells there's a little passage where she tells Nellie about this.
My great thought in living is himself. If all else perished and he remained, I should still continue to be, and if all else remained and he were annihilated, the universe would turn to a mighty stranger, and I should seem not part of it. My love for Linton is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it, I'm well aware, as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. Nellie, I am Heathcliff. He always in my mind, not as a pleasure, any more than I am always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being. So don't talk of our separation again. It is impractical.
So the two kind of key metaphors there for the two men, we've got Linton as the foliage that rots and Heathcliff as the rocks that endure. And I suppose that's not unusual, choosing those images as, you know, representing a light affection on the one hand and a deep love on the other. But then, you know, you think of the context in which they're spoken to Nellie, the housekeeper, by a woman who's bearing a child by the man of foliage, but is in love with the man of rocks. You know, it does, to me, set it apart from any other novel, and certainly any novel of female infidelity, if you like, such as Madame Bovary. I mean, who else but Emily could have written that passage? And maybe the passion in it is one of the reasons that generations of readers remain so passionate about Wuthering Heights. Now, interestingly, one of Emily's poems uses a rather similar pair of opposed images or metaphors.
Love is like the wild rose briar, friendship like the holly tree. The holly is dark when the rose briar blooms, but which will bloom most constantly? The wild rose briar is sweet in spring, its summer blossoms scent the air. Yet wait till winter comes again, and who will call the wild briar fair? Then scorn this silly rose wreath now, and deck thee with the holly's sheen, that when December blights thy brow, he still may leave thy garland green.
So, think back to the Heathcliff Linton thing. But here, the foliage is the wild rosebriar, and the rock becomes holly, because as an evergreen, holly sticks around like a rock, as opposed to the seasonal faltering of a rose. That poem is sometimes called Love and Friendship, and you could say, oh, maybe that's Emily's real view, that she values friendship more than love. That's what the poem seemed to value, friendship higher than love. And of course, in Wuthering Heights, Cathy's love for Heathcliff does derive back to the friendship they had in childhood. And yet it seems unlikely in the end that Emily would put friendship higher than love. And again, we don't know what she truly thinks. There she is, a young woman in her 20s, playing around with ideas, playing around with verse forms and novelistic devices. I say play because play isn't something we tend to associate with the Brontes. The whole myth somehow swamps them in earnestness and duty and labour and illness and death. I never caused a smile of joy since I was born, one Emily poem says. And I see around me tombstones grey. A view from the parsonage. And, we talked, there have been sessions earlier today where the word trauma has come up, and think of the trauma that Emily endured. By the age of 6, the loss of her mother and 2 sisters. Later, her beloved aunt, later still, Branwell. For time and death and mortal pain give wounds that will not heal again. A lot of death in the poems, but I am very suspicious of any theory that Emily had a death wish and didn't fight the illness that killed her as if she could anyway. In that last diary note of 1841, I think it is, in that she described herself as having learnt to make the most of, God, I've lost my page. Having learnt to make the most of the present and hope for the future with less fidgetiness that I cannot do all I wish, merely desiring that everybody could be as comfortable as myself and as undesponding. Undesponding, great word. And also as comfortable as myself. And she's imagining herself, they do these diary notes every 4 years, she's imagining herself ahead in time, which I think somebody with a desire for death would never do. And add to that Charlotte's description of her being torn, panting and reluctant from life when she died, rather than willing death to come. So I'd like to get rid of that myth of the death wish. And what's also striking, and here I think some playfulness comes in again, is that when she is writing about death, and equally as she did so often when she's writing about night, how energized she is. The darkness isn't scary to Emily, and gloom seems to kick her into life. And, when the sisters got together in the evening to write, walking around, imagination set them free. And in Emily's case, working at night led to her constantly using images of night. The night was dark, yet winter breathed. There shines the moon of noon of night. The starry night shall tidings bring. How I do love on summer nights. The moon is full this winter night. And so on. There are lots and lots of examples. Best of all, to my mind, partly because it's so terse, is the night is darkening round me.
The night is darkening around me. The wild winds coldly blow. But a tyrant spell has bound me, and I cannot go. The giant trees are bending, their bare boughs weighed with snow, and the storm is fast descending, and yet I cannot go. Clouds beyond clouds above me, wastes beyond wastes below, but nothing drear can move me. I will not, cannot go.
I mean, you think, a coming storm, wild winds, bending trees, that idea of captivity, you'd think maybe the mood would be fearful and defeated, but the tone of that poem is so defiant rather than passive. It's, she's trapped, but the poem's repetitions are animated rather than crushed. I will not, cannot go. It's so fiercely defiant. It reminds me a little bit of Robert Frost's poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, where there's a similar inability to move, as if he's too mesmerized and she's mesmerized perhaps. And there's a sense of enchantment that comes through all those repetitions of the word not. Or perhaps it's just stubbornness, I know she damn well isn't going to go. So I think I'm saying that, to me, reading that notebook, she's never so alive as when looking at the worst of life and what it can bring. And there's always light in the darkness. And we get some of that in another poem that Yusra is going to read, called Stars.
Why, because the dazzling sun restored our earth to joy, have you departed, everyone, and left a desert sky? All through the night your glorious eyes were gazing down in mine, and with a full heart's thankful sighs, I blessed that watch divine. I was at peace and drank your beams as they were life to me, and revelled in my changeful dreams, like petrol on the sea. Thought followed thought, star followed star, through boundless regions on, while one sweet influence near and far thrilled through and proved us one. Why did the morning dawn to break, So great, so pure a spell, and scorch with fire the tranquil cheek where your cool radiance fell. Blood red he rose, and arrow straight his fierce beam struck my brow. The soul of nature sprang elate, but mine sank sad and low. My lids closed down, yet through their veil I saw him blazing still, and steep in gold the misty dale, and flash upon the hill. I turned me to the pillow then, to call back night, and see your worlds of solemn light again throb with my heart and me. It would not do. The pillow glowed, and glowed both roof and floor, and birds sang loudly in the wood, and fresh wind shook the door. The curtains waved, the wakened flies were murmuring round my room, imprisoned there till I should rise and give them leave to roam. O stars and dreams and gentle night, O night and stars return, and hide me from the hostile light that does not warm but burn, that drains the blood of suffering men, drinks tears instead of dew. Let me sleep through his blinding rain and only wake with you.
So the stars in that poem are addressed intimately as a you, whereas the sun is a bullying he. And the stars are peaceful, he's warlike, their eyes gaze gently into her eyes, whereas he, the sun, is hostile, scorching, blinding, a light that doesn't comfort but burns. So the stars allow her to dream and imagine, whereas the sun's a monarch who reigns over her and imprisons her. So, you've got this very loaded contrast, going back to the rosebriar and the holly maybe, and the foliage and the rocks. And, Emily can seem elusive, but here she seems to me emphatic and, dare I say it, maybe confessional. She loves the gentle light of the stars. She hates the glare of the sun. There's a battle going on, and it's plain which side she's on. If you think of John Donne's poem, Oh Busy Old Sun, well, there he resents the sun for breaking in on him when he's lying in bed with his lover. Emily, too, resents the sun's bullying, but her poem is written in solitude. It's a lovely plaint and a plea. Just give me the stars, tender gaze. Of course, she loved the daylight, too. Without of it, she wouldn't have walked so freely on the moors. She wouldn't have seen the abundance that she delighted in. The moors meant freedom and independence to her. And those are the qualities I most associate her with her, particularly after reading that notebook. I mean, she isn't as worried about public opinion. She isn't as biddable as Charlotte. She isn't as religious-minded as Anne. And she doesn't identify freedom with escape either. She did comparatively little travelling beyond Haworth, and she was so homesick during the brief period she spent away teaching or in Brussels that she returned home seemingly in deep depression and indeed in some kind of emotional breakdown. Home was where she found independence, and that comes over in this next poem called A Little While, A Little While.
A little while, a little while, the noisy crowds are barred away, and I can sing and I can smile, a little while I'll have holy day. Where wilt thou go, my harassed heart? Full many a land invites thee now, and places near and far apart have rest for thee, my weary brow. There is a spot mid barren hills where winter howls and driving rain, and if the dreary tempest chills, there is a light that warms again. The house is old, the trees are bare, and moonless bends the misty dome. But what on earth is half so dear, so longed for as the hearth of home? The mute bird sitting on the stone, the dank moss dripping from the walls, The garden walk with weeds overgrown, I love them, oh, how I love them all. Shall I go there? Or shall I seek another clime, another sky, where tongues familiar music speak in accents dear to memory? Yes, as I muse the naked room, the flickering firelight died away, and from the mist of cheerless gloom, I passed to bright unclouded day. A little and alone green lane that opened a common wide, a distant, dreamy, dim blue chain of mountains circling every side. A heaven so clear, an earth so calm, so sweet, so hushed an air, and deepening still the dreamlike charm, wild moor sheep feeding everywhere. There was the scene. I knew it well. I knew the pathways far and near that winding over each billowy swell marked out the tracks of wandering deer. Could I have lingered but an hour? It well had paid a week of toil. But truth has banished fancy's power, I hear my dungeon's bars recoil. And even as I stood with raptured eye, absorbed in bliss so deep and dear, my hour of rest has fettered by and given me back to weary care.
You might have heard that very early on in that poem, holy day. She's having holy day. That's a spelling of holiday. Comes out as two words, holy day. Great. Charlotte said that Emily needed an interpreter, that an interpreter ought to have stood between her and the world. And after Emily's death, in effect, Charlotte appointed herself in that role and did so, among other things, by editing some of the lines in her poems, rather like a parent handling an awkward adolescent. And of all the poems in that recently unearthed notebook, this is the poem that she interfered with Charlotte the most. Maybe she thought it too juvenile. Emily wrote it when she was just 20, I think. Maybe she was trying to remove it from a Gondal context, though to me it doesn't seem like that. And there's always this problem when people talk about Emily's poems is, do they belong to Gondal mythology or is it an Emily from the heart poem? But it seems clear to me that as a poem written about Haworth at a time when Emily was away teaching at Law Hill. You got the second line, which alludes to her love of solitude. The noisy crowd are barred away. Well, I think the noisy crowd are probably pupils. And to Emily, who hated company of a large kind, any more than a couple of people would probably be a crowd, unless they're friends at home. Charlotte changed that line to the weary task is put away, rather than the noisy crowd. Later, Emily talks about the garden walk with weeds o'ergrown. Charlotte changed this to the gable grey the walk, as if keen to get rid of those weeds. As if wanting to protect the reputation of the parsonage as a respectable place, not one ruined by weeds. And it seems to me very surprising that she weeded out the weeds, because she famously, Charlotte, objected to the landscape of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice as being too neat, carefully fenced, highly cultivated garden with neat borders and delicate flowers, no open country, no fresh air, no blue hill, no bonny beck. Charlotte's case against Jane Austen. And there she is weeding out Emily's weeds, removing a whole stanza. Emily's mountains become moorland, because truer to Haworth perhaps. Emily's deer become sheep for the same reason. And finally, the line that includes dungeon bars goes and becomes restraint and heavy task recoil. As if, you can't talk about dungeon bars. So some of the most expansive images in that poem, weeds, dungeons, deer, mountains, are taken away to tamp it down. This is why, over the years, Charlotte's revisions, her management of her sister's reputations have become so vexed, and why some people feel hostile to Charlotte for that reason. from questioning whether whether it was right that a creature like Heathcliff should ever have been allowed to exist. I scarcely think it is, Charlotte said, to calling Anne's Lieutenant of Wildfell Hall an entire mistake. She's seen as a busybody and a control freak. But as someone said earlier today, if you think of the grief that she was going through at the time of losing Emily and Anne in a short space of time, and if you think back to some of the early hostile notices of their work, particularly Emily's unbelievable hostility towards Wuthering Heights in the early days, you can understand why she felt uncomfortable, and if that meant conceding a bit too much, apologising for them as immature. Well, she also defended and praised them. I think she was on their side, but she was aware of ideas building up of them being too wild creatures of the moors, and she wanted to qualify that. So I'd say those, I don't really want her to be demonised as a meddler. And let's also remember her anxiety about her own worth. One item I enjoyed seeing in the recently unearthed archive was a letter from Charlotte to a novelist called Julia Kavanagh, which she tucked inside, which is tucked inside a first edition of Jane Eyre, and which shows her in characteristic self-deprecating mood. She tells Julia her novel is but a defective production. I only wish it had been in my power to offer you some less insipid token of esteem. In outliving Emily and Anne by 7 or more years, she enjoyed more acclaim than they did. They didn't live to see any acclaim, but she did know that much of that acclaim was for them. She was their representative on earth, but not necessarily their superior as a writer. So in the end, what I took away from that notebook in the British Library, or now on display at the Brotherton, it wasn't a spiritual Emily so much as a worldly one. Yeah, you get capitalized abstractions, you get hymn-like incantations, and images of, if you like, gloom. Her being a foster child of sore distress. But what really struck me was this rapt, homespun attentiveness to the physical world around her. The moths fluttering among the heath and harebells, the old church tower and garden wall black with autumn rain, 2 trees in a lonely field, high waving heather, wild moor sheep, the linnet trilling its song on an old granite stone, drizzly mist, winter sun setting in a sullen sky, dank moss dripping from the wall, leaves full of sap, grey flocks in ferny dens, bees among the heather bells, a little and a lone green lane opening on a common, the house dog stretched on the glowing floor, a little lamp burning, a cheerful hearth, an open parlour window, the wild wind blowing on the mountainside. It's the ordinary world around us too, although perhaps less so now that nature has been so denuded. How often do we see linnets? So these were the commonplace riches that Emily held in high esteem. They're the reason her work endures 175 years on. I mean, it's always difficult to untangle the lives of the Brontes from what they wrote. We read Wuthering Heights and we wonder how Emily could ever have written it, how someone who, as far as we know, never had a sexual relationship with anyone or anything close could know so much about sexual passion. We read Jane Eyre and wonder whether Charlotte's love for Monsieur Heger in Brussels, whether that in any way informed that novel and her love for the love for Rochester. And we think of Anne saying, just before she died, that she longed to do some good in the world before she left it. And how her last words to Charlotte were, "Take courage," which are, funnily enough, the last words that Seamus Heaney said, though he said them in a text and he said them in Latin. What a family. How much they still affect us is beautifully captured in one final poem you hear, not by Emily Bronte, but by a colleague of mine at Goldsmiths, where I teach creative writing, a colleague called Maura Dooley. It appears in a poem in a new collection just out called 555. And I think it gets across, this poem, The Unforgotten, how much we're still all haunted by the Brontes.
At Anne Bronte's grave, in the salt air she loved, where the words were almost lost from the stone dissolving, you first kissed me. And once we took my parents to see the rain, the moorland, the tiny writing we struggled to read, stepping out dazed into that garden of tombs gleaming in the damp light. And sometimes I swipe at crumbs or a dry plate with my souvenir linen image of 3 melded heads fading indistinct. But today, I open a beaten copy of the novels of the Bronte sisters, the only thing left of my grandmother's time on earth to read, in her bold, emphatic hand. Nearer than the living are the unforgotten dead. Their presence is ever with you, and they walk always at your side.
She's abandoning me.
You're the expert on Bronte.
No, I'm not.
Thank you so much to Blake and to Yusra as well for bringing that material to life and from your engagement with the collection. And we have 5 minutes for questions from the audience. So the lady over there.
Currently doing some research on Mr. Law. I've got involved with the Civic Trust because, I mean, as you know, the collection was just vast. And also because his main competitor was Morgan Stanley, so I'm actually going to the Morgan Stanley Library in New York to actually look at the collection he didn't get in the letters that I've been reading. But my question to you, obviously the consortium were very fortunate to get these items. If you hadn't, and somebody had said to you, right, you can only have one piece from this collection, what would you have picked?
Well, I don't know all that's in it. Maybe you know, Ken, but I'm quite happy to have Emily's notebook. Thank you very much. I wouldn't have minded her second novel as well, but it doesn't exist.
Hello. I did get a chance to go to the Treasures of the Brotherton Gallery and had a look at what was on display, and it was really amazing just to see it all. You were mentioning about the possibility that Emily would have written a second novel. Do you think it is? Do you think it actually is possible to maybe like gather what any inspiration or any notes that she had, and maybe take up the mantle of producing the novel yourself, or maybe someone else? Do you think it's possible to write it based on what Emily had already written down?
A short answer, no. It may be someone's already done it. I don't know. But there was just a passing reference in a letter with a suggestion to a publisher that she might be working on a second novel, but it's ambiguous, and scholars, as far as I can tell, I'm not a scholar, are unsure whether she was. But of course, it's fascinating to think that she might have been, and she might have got a long way with it. That it might have been destroyed by Charlotte because it was so even more outrageous than Wuthering Heights. But we don't know. We don't. So as far as I know, we don't know.
And the lady at the back there.
I saw the exhibition, which was brilliant, and I noticed the first edition given to Martha Brown, and I remember going once to the parsonage and seeing something else about the traits and stories of the Irish peasantry given to Martha Brown. So I wanted to ask you how important you thought the Irish influences from the parsonage were on Emily's writing.
It's a very interesting question, which I'm not expert enough to answer. I like to think, since I had an Irish parent, that the Irishness was very important. to her, and it may well have been, but I don't know enough about it, to be honest with you. I mean, something must have come down to her from Patrick, I'm quite sure, quite aside from her own reading. But I can't say more than that, really.
Thanks, Blake. And this lady again here.
So Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights have a lot of like supernatural elements, like very spooky, very like really like makes you go oh shivers and in the night and stuff. Where do you think they got the supernatural elements from? Like what inspired them to write the spooky stuff of the books?
Well, I suppose the Gothic tradition was already underway, and they would have, from their reading, would have, picked some of that up.
So like Frankenstein and
yeah, which people were speculating out about earlier, weren't they? For me, my own taste tends more to the realism than the fantastical stuff. But you're right, it's there. Yeah.
Thanks so much to Blake. Thanks so much to Yusra. Absolutely brilliant. And thank you to the audience for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the festival, please subscribe, share this episode with others and leave a rating. Don't forget to mark your calendars as the Bradford Literature Festival returns for its 10th year from 28th of June to the 7th of July 2024.